Officer Nathan, young and in full uniform, sat quietly in the corner of Rosie's diner, scanning his hefty meal receipt. His stern expression and refusal to settle the bill caught everyone's attention. The usually bustling diner fell silent, eyes fixed on Nathan as the waitress nervously approached him. The waitress's hand trembled as she dialed 911, unsure how to ask for the police when the police were already in the building. "I'm requesting a police car to be sent to Rosie's diner," Sadie said with a trembling voice, just around the corner so Officer Nathan couldn't hear her. She heard the dispatcher typing frantically, and then she answered. "I see there is already an officer at the scene," she asked confusedly. Sadie didn't know what to say. Yeah. It's about him." The dispatcher fell silent for a moment. "Can I ask what it's about?" she asked. Sadie looked around the corner at Officer Nathan, who had ripped the bill and thrown it on the ground. It looked like he was about to burst into tears as well as throw a chair through the window. "It's hard to explain," Sadie eventually said, hoping to be mysterious enough for the dispatcher to let it go. "All right, a second police car is on the way," the dispatcher said, emphasizing the word second. Sadie hung up the phone with a sigh. If this got out of hand, it would be the officer's word against hers. She suddenly heard someone yelling in the diner area and quickly rushed over, only to find Officer Nathan trying to exit without paying his bill. Rosie, the owner of the diner, stood with her arms crossed, blocking the door. "I don't care if you're the president. You pay for your bill," she said boldly. Sadie could see a vein popping up on Officer Nathan's forehead. "You don't understand," he mumbled, balding his fists. "If you don't move now, you're putting all your guests in danger." Rosie raised an eyebrow. "You're going to hurt every single person here?" she said, mockingly, while printing out a new bill from her billing machine. "All because of a $100 bill?" she added. Murmur erupted among the other diners as all eyes and ears were focused on Officer Nathan. Little did they know, there was more to his story. Officer Nathan's eyes pierced Rosie's, but she did not step aside at all. He looked around him at the other diners, and it almost seemed like there was a bit of remorse behind his frustration. Sadie quickly walked up the pair, wanting to ease the tension. "Officer, could you please explain the issue to us? We might be able to work this out," she said kindly. Officer Nathan's eyes darted to something outside for a second, then back at Sadie. He was about to open his mouth when his eyes suddenly widened in shock. Everything happened very fast, but Sadie remembered Officer Nathan pulling her and Rosie away from the door just as two masked men with guns drawn pushed through them. "Everybody on the ground! Now!" All of the diner's guests yelled and screamed as they lay flat on their stomachs on the ground. Sadie looked up at Officer Nathan with hope in her eyes, but that was quickly stripped away when she saw one of the masked men approaching him. "What the fuck took you so long, man?" he hissed, just loud enough for Sadie to hear. Officer Nathan seemed uncomfortable and unsure. It was clear that he didn't want to be here at this moment, but there was something else about him. Then it dawned on Sadie. Officer Nathan looked scared more than anyone else in the room, and the masked men didn't seem very happy with Officer Nathan either. He had clearly failed them, but how? One of the masked men yelled at Nathan to get on the ground as well after removing the gun from his holster and kicking it to the other side of the room. Officer Nathan obliged and got down on his knees. For a moment he and Sadie locked eyes, and it seemed like he tried to apologize, mouthing, "I'm sorry," as he lay all the way down. Sadie, Rosie, and the other diners lay trembling on the floor, their hearts pounding in their chests. The silence was shattered by the harsh commands of the masked men, who paced menacingly, their guns ready. Sadie's breath came in short, frightened bursts as she tried to stay still, her cheek pressed against the cool, hard floor. The fear in the air was almost tangible, every person holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. The masked men barked orders, demanding everyone's wallets and phones, causing more panic. "Empty your pockets now," one of them yelled. his voice harsh and unforgiving. Diners fumbled with their belongings, tossing them toward the masked men, who scooped them up greedily. Sadie's hands shook as she slid her phone across the floor, her eyes darting around, looking for any sign of hope. The air was thick with tension and fear. Rosie glanced at Officer Nathan, her eyes pleading for an explanation, but he remained silent and tense. His face was a mask of conflict, the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Rosie's eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and confusion, silently begging Nathan to do something, anything, to help. Nathan's jaw was set, his mind racing, but his body frozen, unsure of how to proceed without making things worse. Sadie clutched her phone tightly, afraid to move or make a sound, praying for the ordeal to end soon. Her knuckles were white from gripping her phone, her body tense and unmoving. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the chaos around her. The diner's usual warm, inviting atmosphere was replaced with a chilling sense of dread. Sadie's thoughts were a jumble, her only clear desire being to survive this terrifying ordeal. The masked men continued their demands, becoming increasingly agitated with each passing moment. "Hurry up!" one of them shouted, kicking a chair out of his way in frustration. The diners complied as quickly as they could, fear evident in their every movement. Nathan's silence was palpable, his eyes darting between the masked men and the helpless diners. The tension in the room was unbearable, each second dragging out painfully as the situation grew more volatile. The masked men seemed to know exactly what they were looking for as one of them approached the counter. His eyes scanned the area with a focused intensity, as if he had been here before. "Where is it?" he barked, slamming his fist on the counter. The diners watched in fear, unsure of what "it" was. The masked man's urgency made the room's tension spike even higher. One masked man demanded access to the diner's safe, his voice menacing and impatient. "Open the safe now!" he shouted, pointing his gun at Rosie. The other diners watched in terrified silence, their eyes darting between Rosie and the masked men. Rosie's hands trembled as she tried to understand what he was talking about, the threat of violence hanging heavy in the air. Rosie shook her head in confusion, stammering that there was no safe, her fear evident. "I don't have a safe," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. The masked man's eyes narrowed in anger, his patience wearing thin. The room felt like it was closing in, the tension and fear almost suffocating. The second masked man, growing impatient, grabbed Sadie and pulled her to her feet. "Maybe you'll be more cooperative," he sneered, pressing the cold barrel of his gun against her back. Sadie gasped, her eyes wide with terror. The diners watched helplessly, their fear mirrored in Sadie's expression. The room was charged with dread, every movement magnified by the impending threat of violence. Pressing his gun against Sadie's temple, he threatened her life, increasing the tension in the room. "Tell me where the safe is or she dies," he yelled, his voice echoing in the silent diner. Sadie's breath came in short, panicked bursts, her eyes pleading for mercy. The other diners were frozen in fear, unable to help. The masked man's threat hung heavy in the air, everyone waiting for the next move. Officer Nathan's face twisted in anguish as he watched the situation escalate, feeling helpless. He could see the fear in Sadie's eyes and the desperation in Rosie's stance. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and he felt paralyzed. The masked men's threats and demands filled the room with a heavy tension that seemed almost tangible. Nathan's heart raced as he struggled to find a way to defuse the situation. He knew he had to act, but was torn between his duty and the fear of what might happen if he intervened. His training told him to protect the innocent, but the guns pointed at Sadie made him hesitate. Nathan's mind was a whirlwind of possible outcomes, each more dangerous than the last. He glanced around the diner, searching for any opportunity to turn the tide without putting everyone at greater risk. The masked man holding Sadie growled, "You better start talking, officer, or she gets it." His grip on Sadie tightened, making her wince. The threat hung heavy in the air, and Nathan felt the eyes of the hostages turn to him, pleading for action. The masked man's impatience was palpable, his finger twitching on the trigger. Nathan's mind raced, trying to come up with a plan to save Sadie. Nathan struggled with his conscience, his mind racing through possible solutions. He knew he had to think fast, but every idea seemed fraught with danger. The fear of making a wrong move and causing more harm paralyzed him. The masked men's anger was growing, and Nathan could see they were running out of patience. Sadie looked at Nathan, her eyes filled with fear and hope, silently begging for his help. Nathan felt a surge of determination as their eyes locked. He couldn't let her down. He glanced around the room, searching for any advantage. The masked men were focused on their threats, giving Nathan a sliver of a chance. He knew he had to act soon, but he needed to be smart about it. Rosie, despite the danger, stood up and faced the masked men, her heart pounding. The fear in her chest was almost overwhelming, but she knew she had to do something. The room fell silent as she rose, all eyes turning to her. The masked men's gazes hardened, their guns still aimed at the hostages. Rosie took a deep breath, her resolve hardening with each passing second. "Let her go, and take me instead," she demanded, her voice shaking but resolute. The room was so quiet that her words seemed to echo off the walls. Sadie's eyes widened in shock, and Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The masked men seemed taken aback by her courage. Rosie's hands trembled slightly, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to back down. The masked men exchanged glances, momentarily thrown off by her bravery. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from someone like Rosie. The hesitation was brief, but noticeable. One of them tightened his grip on his gun, while the other seemed to consider her offer. The tension in the diner was thick, the hostages holding their breath, hoping this would be the turning point. Nathan's mind raced for a solution, knowing this was a critical moment. Rosie's brave stand had given him a small window of opportunity. He scanned the room, looking for anything that could be used to their advantage. The masked men's attention was divided, giving him a chance to act. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but he knew he had to make a move soon. Just as tension peaked, the diner's back door creaked open, and an elderly man with a cane stepped in, unnoticed by the masked men. The sound was almost lost in the chaos, but Nathan's sharp eyes caught the movement. The elderly man looked around, quickly assessing the situation. He moved quietly, blending into the shadows as he edged closer to the counter. The elderly man looked at the scene before him and quickly ducked behind the counter. His heart pounded in his chest as he took in the gravity of the situation. The diner, usually a place of warmth and laughter, now felt like a battlefield. He moved as quietly as he could, hoping to remain unnoticed by the masked men who were still focused on their hostages. He pulled out his phone to call for backup, his hands trembling but determined. He knew he had to stay calm and get help as quickly as possible. His fingers fumbled slightly as he dialed the number, but he took a deep breath and steadied himself. The elderly man's face was set with resolve, knowing that every second counted in this dire situation. His arrival remained unnoticed as he whispered urgently into the phone, describing the situation. "We need police at Rosie's diner now. Hostages are being held by armed men," he said, keeping his voice as low as possible. The dispatcher's calm voice on the other end reassured him that help was on the way. He stayed crouched behind the counter, trying to stay out of sight. Meanwhile, Sadie and Rosie still stood next to the masked men, unsure what was going to happen next. Sadie's mind raced, trying to make sense of the chaos around her. Rosie, though terrified, kept a brave face, hoping to inspire courage in the other hostages. The masked men were becoming more agitated, their patience wearing thin as the situation dragged on. The tension in the diner was palpable, everyone waiting for the next move. The air felt heavy, each breath taken with caution. The masked men's eyes darted around the room, their nerves fraying. Nathan, Sadie, and the other hostages could feel the situation teetering on the edge of chaos. Every second felt like an eternity, the silence filled with unspoken fears and desperate hopes for a swift resolution. The sound of approaching sirens gave a brief glimmer of hope to the hostages, their anxiety momentarily lifting. The distant wail was like a promise of salvation, cutting through the oppressive silence. Sadie felt a flicker of relief, her eyes darting to Nathan. The hostages exchanged nervous glances, the sound signaling that help was near. For the first time, there was a hint of light in the midst of their terror. The masked men panicked, tightening their grip on their weapons and hostages, their desperation growing. "Stay down!" one of them barked, his voice cracking with tension. The sirens grew louder, signaling the imminent arrival of the police. The hostages could see the fear in the masked men's eyes, their plan unraveling. The atmosphere was electric with anxiety, each second feeling like an eternity as the sirens approached. Nathan seized the moment, using a signal he had noticed from the elderly man to indicate a plan was in motion. He caught the man's eye and gave a slight nod, hoping the others would follow his lead. The hostages watched Nathan closely, sensing that something was about to happen. Nathan's heart raced as he prepared to act, knowing this might be their only chance to turn the tide. The masked men looked around nervously, realizing they were running out of time. Their eyes darted between the hostages and the windows, the sound of sirens growing louder with each passing second. "We need to move!" one of them hissed, his voice filled with panic. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone holding their breath as they waited for the next move. Nathan's signal had set things in motion, but the outcome was still uncertain. The sirens grew louder, signaling that backup was arriving, increasing the pressure on the masked men. The sound was almost deafening now, a constant reminder that the police were closing in. The hostages felt a mix of fear and hope, knowing that help was near but unsure what the masked men might do next. Nathan watched the masked men closely, ready to act when the moment was right. With the second police car arriving outside, a tense standoff began, the atmosphere thick with tension. The flashing lights and blaring sirens added to the urgency of the moment. The masked men tightened their grip on their weapons, their eyes darting toward the door. Inside the diner, the hostages remained frozen in fear, sensing the critical nature of the situation. Nathan knew that one wrong move could escalate things beyond control. The masked men dragged Nathan and Sadie to the front of the diner, using them as human shields. "Stay where we can see you," one of the men growled, his gun pressed against Nathan's back. Sadie stumbled forward, her heart racing, her eyes wide with fear. The police outside adjusted their positions, wary of the hostages' safety. The tension inside the diner was unbearable, everyone holding their breath. Negotiations began, with the police trying to calm the situation, their voices steady but urgent. "We just want everyone to get out of this safely," the lead negotiator called out. "Let's talk this through." The masked men glanced at each other, their resolve wavering slightly. Nathan could sense a shift, a small opening. The negotiator's calm tone contrasted sharply with the fear and chaos inside the diner. Nathan whispered assurances to Sadie, trying to keep her calm amidst the chaos. "Stay with me, Sadie. We're going to get through this," he murmured, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Sadie nodded slightly, her eyes filling with tears but her grip on Nathan's arm tightening. The bond between them grew stronger, a shared determination to survive this ordeal. The lead negotiator attempted to establish a dialogue, hoping to de-escalate the situation peacefully. "Tell us what you need, and we'll work with you," he urged, his voice carrying a note of sincerity. The masked men seemed to hesitate, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. The tension remained high, but the negotiator's words planted a seed of doubt. Nathan and Sadie, held onto that glimmer of hope, waiting for the next move. One of the masked men, growing increasingly desperate, shouted out the window, "We need a way out, or people start dying." His voice was filled with panic, echoing in the tense silence outside. The police officers exchanged worried glances, their hands hovering over their weapons. Inside the diner, the hostages flinched at the outburst, their fear intensifying. Nathan knew the situation was reaching a breaking point, the masked men's desperation making them even more dangerous. The lead officer outside tried to stall, negotiating for more time and a peaceful resolution. "We understand your demands, but we need to ensure everyone's safety," he called out, his voice steady. "Let's talk this through calmly." The masked men hesitated, their eyes flickering with uncertainty. Nathan could feel the slight shift, the possibility of diffusing the situation if they played their cards right. Every second counted now. Nathan knew they were running out of time, the situation becoming increasingly volatile. The masked men's nerves were fraying, their movements more erratic. Nathan's mind raced, calculating their next steps. He glanced at Sadie, seeing the fear in her eyes, and knew he had to act fast. The tension in the diner was suffocating, each heartbeat loud in the silent room. The urgency of the moment pressed down on him. He discreetly activated the emergency alert on his police radio, hoping it would buy them a few precious minutes. The small, hidden button sent out a silent signal, alerting the backup units. Nathan kept his movements subtle, not wanting to draw attention from the masked men. He prayed the alert would bring the necessary reinforcements quickly. Every second felt like a countdown, the tension escalating with each tick of the clock. The hostages held their breath, their eyes darting between the masked men and Nathan. The masked men's desperation was visible, their grips on their weapons tightening. Nathan stayed alert, ready to act at a moment's notice. The atmosphere was thick with fear and anticipation, everyone bracing for the next move. In a hushed voice, Nathan finally revealed the truth to Sadie. "They threatened to kill me if I didn't help them," he confessed, his voice breaking. Sadie's eyes widened as she absorbed his words, the reality of the situation becoming clearer. Nathan's face was etched with fear and regret, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his confession. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of fear and understanding. "They forced me to use a special card that would instantly hack into Rosie's bank account and transfer her money to them." Nathan's voice was barely above a whisper, his eyes pleading for understanding. Sadie listened intently, her heart pounding as she grasped the gravity of what he was saying. The masked men's plan was more intricate than she had imagined, their desperation driving them to extreme emissaries. Sadie's eyes widened as she processed Nathan's confession. "So that's why you were acting so strangely," she whispered. Nathan nodded, his expression one of deep remorse. Sadie felt a pang of sympathy mixed with her own fear, realizing the impossible position Nathan had been put in. The situation was more complicated than she had thought, and her anger began to mix with understanding as she looked at Nathan. Nathan nodded, shame and fear evident on his face as he added, "But I never meant for it to go this far." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, the weight of his guilt pressing heavily on him. Sadie could see the torment in his eyes, the conflict between his duty and the desperate situation he had been forced into. Nathan's confession hung in the air, a silent plea for forgiveness. Sadie felt a mix of anger and sympathy, understanding the gravity of Nathan's situation. She wanted to be angry at him, but the fear and desperation in his eyes softened her resolve. "I get it now," she said softly, her voice shaking. Nathan looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. The tension between them was thick, but a silent understanding passed between them, a shared determination to survive. Nathan explained that the emergency button he pressed earlier had caught the attention back at the station. "They know something's wrong," he said, his voice low but steady. Backup is on the way. Sadie felt a flicker of hope at his words, realizing they might not be as alone as they felt. The gravity of their situation remained, but knowing help was coming made it a bit easier to breathe. More police cars were on their way, the backup offering a glimmer of hope. The sound of additional sirens in the distance reassured the hostages that the cavalry was near. Nathan looked at Sadie, his eyes filled with determination. "We just need to hold on a little longer," he said. The room was still tense, but the knowledge that more help was coming gave everyone a slight lift. With newfound determination, Sadie and Nathan formulated a quick plan to disarm the masked men. They whispered quickly, their eyes darting around the room to ensure they weren't overheard. Nathan outlined a strategy, highlighting their strengths and the weaknesses of their captors. Sadie nodded, absorbing every detail, her resolve hardening. They knew the risks were high, but the alternative was unthinkable. Nathan encouraged Sadie, stating they could still stop the masked men together. "We've got this, Sadie," he whispered, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "We just need to be smart and work together." Sadie met his gaze, feeling a surge of courage. "I'm with you," she replied. Their mutual trust and determination were palpable, a small but powerful force against the chaos surrounding them. The urgency of their situation fueled their determination to act swiftly and decisively. Every second counted as they prepared to put their plan into action. The masked men were still on edge, their attention divided. Nathan and Sadie exchanged one last look, a silent agreement passing between them. They took deep breaths, ready for what was to come. As the police outside created a diversion, Nathan and Sadie managed to overpower the masked men. The loud noises and flashing lights outside drew the attackers' attention just long enough. Nathan lunged at one of the masked men, knocking the gun from his hand. At the same moment, Sadie kicked the other man's knee, causing him to stumble. Their sudden action caught the attackers off guard, giving them a brief advantage. Their sudden and coordinated effort disarmed the attackers, the element of surprise on their side. Nathan wrestled the gun away, securing it, while Sadie grabbed a nearby chair, holding it defensively. The masked men, shocked by the unexpected resistance, hesitated. The hostages watched in astonishment as Nathan and Sadie turned the tide. The room buzzed with newfound hope as the tables began to turn against the masked men. The police rushed in, securing the situation and ensuring the safety of the hostages. Officers stormed through the front door, their guns drawn, quickly subduing the disarmed attackers. The hostages were ushered to safety, relief washing over them. Nathan and Sadie stood together, their ordeal finally coming to an end. The tension in the room began to dissipate as the police took control, restoring a sense of order and security. Nathan was taken into custody, but not without a promise from Sadie to testify to his coerced involvement. "I'll make sure they know what really happened," she assured him, her voice firm. Nathan nodded, gratitude in his eyes. The officers led him away, but Sadie's words echoed in his mind. He knew that her testimony could make all the difference. The future was uncertain, but there was a glimmer of hope. The ordeal ended with a sense of relief and a promise of justice as Sadie vowed to support Nathan through the aftermath. The diner slowly returned to normal, the fear and chaos replaced by a quiet resilience. Sadie looked around, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and determination. She knew the road ahead would be tough, but she was ready to fight for Nathan. Together, they had faced the worst and come out stronger. Do you like this touching and surprising story? If so, we invite you to leave us a comment expressing your opinion. If you want to continue enjoying inspiring stories like this one, subscribe to our channel or check out the other videos shown at the bottom of the screen. Thank you for your cooperation.